everyone, welcome again to another section of Music 1300. I am, of course, Professor George. We are here for the last lecture in our second unit, which happens to be focused on timbre, or instrumental tone color. Today, we're going to be exclusively looking at the Romantic era and a performing ensemble known as the orchestra, which we've already investigated a number of times so far this semester, but we're going to look at it in a more concentrated fashion and sort of have a detailed look into what Romantic era composers were doing with the orchestra in comparison to what was happening in the classical era or the era to come after the 20th and 21st century, more avant-garde kind of compositional techniques and orchestrational advances. So at this point, the best thing to have is a piece of paper for you to take your own notes with. You're also going to want to definitely revisit some of these musical examples. The Romantic era composers were especially well known for being interested in longer formats. We're going to listen to a number of program symphonies and tone poems today, two particular forms of orchestral works that are driven to storytelling. Usually that storytelling element is done without the use of a narrator, but rather relies on the imagination of the listener. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my lecture notes, and we're going to talk about the general characteristics of music in the Romantic era, especially as it applies to the performing ensemble, the orchestra. All right, here are the lecture notes for today's lecture, Nationalism and Exoticism. We're, like I said, taking a look at tone poems and program symphonies from the Romantic era. Characteristics of Romantic era music. The first thing that we're going to generally hear in Romantic era music is a tendency to have a programmatic element within the piece of music. That can be a mood, something that's more general, or something that is much more specific and has a kind of storyline to it. There are a couple of particular programs or narrative devices that Romantic era composers were particularly interested in. The first one is the interest in nature and how man interacts with nature. Probably the best example of this is a literary example of this storytelling device, Frankenstein, which is very much in the Romantic Gothic canon. So, of course, there is a man of science who, in sort of defying act of nature and science, creates man, and what becomes of that is the narrative that follows. But that was a plot point that was somewhat interesting to, or of interest to, Romantic era composers. We also have a nostalgia for the past, particularly epic tales and legends. So lots of revival of Shakespeare that happens at this time, particularly when we're talking about Romantic era opera. Verdi ends up restaging and rethinking, not so much in terms of what happens plot-wise, but definitely a condensed version of Macbeth. And he is not the only composer that was interested in reviving Shakespearean ideas. And there's, of course, also a sort of small revival of Greek ideas that were presented on stage. So that is one, or another rather, of the narratives that Romantic era composers were interested in. One of my favorites is the preoccupation with magic, the supernatural, the fantastic, and the religious. So there's an obsession with the tritone at this point, an interval, a distance between one note and another note, that was said in the medieval era and prior to evoke the devil. We're going to have a whole lecture that's dedicated to just the discussion of the tritone, so I'm not going to discuss that too much right now, but that ends up being something that comes forth in the musical harmonic layer in orchestral music and even small ensemble music at this time. Magic, one of the first listening examples that we're going to listen to today, is indeed focused on magic. So we have a lot of narratives that either have magical undertones or supernatural undertones or quasi-religious undertones, more speaking about like the devil and the appearance of the devil in music. Lastly, we have this curiosity about the musical other that comes about in orchestral music and other music of the Romantic era. This is sort of responded with this equally interesting idea of how to represent nationalism in music. So we have these sort of opposing compositional ideas. A lot of composers interested in exploring musical harmonic languages that were outside of the Western classical canon, if they were from, you know, Western Europe, and the same, you know, thing for Eastern European composers being interested in what the Western European composers were interested in doing, and of course that reaction of being very steadfast in representing sort of heritage in music. So we're going to hear that as a trend as well. So all of those narrative characteristics are a part of every single listening example that I've picked for this lecture today. We're still, and I'll make sure to draw attention to which one we're listening to or why it hits upon several Romantic era characteristics. We're still going to be interested in the other ideas that we've covered so far in unit number 1, and that's going to be texture and rhythm and meter. So in terms of texture, we're still going to be hearing a lot of homophonic texture, but due to the narrative that some composers wish the audience members to think about, we're going to encounter more complicated textures because of this idea right here, leitmotifs. Leitmotifs are melodies that represent a person, place, idea, character, or situation. They're somewhat like theme music. They are ideas, they're melodic ideas that are really adhered to either a character or an idea. We hear them all the time in film music and music for staged productions. And one of the things that you're going to notice today in the listening examples that we cover is that a lot of what we're listening to sounds like cinematic underscoring. It sounds like a film score, a soundtrack, like something like it's supposed to be narrating an event or underscoring an event, like an action sequence or a chase scene, or the moment where you know, two love interests meet, for example. So we're going to hear a lot of those kind of cinematic qualities within the compositions that we listen to, and a part of that is because of this leitmotivic design, the idea that there's a melody that represents you know, a number of different programmatic elements within the piece of music. There are a couple of other tells regarding rhythm and meter that indicate that we're listening to pieces of the Romantic era and no other era. Usually, pieces from the Romantic era are within a particular time signature on a section, at least on a section by section basis, kind of like chapter markings in a book. But there's lots of pushing and pulling, rubato. There's lots of accelerating the tempo or pulling him back in like a rallentando. We're going to encounter what we call mixed meter, and like I said, on a section by section basis, where maybe the first section is in compound time and the second section is in simple time. We're also going to encounter musical ideas called fermatas, where there are dramatic holds of blocks of sound that the instrumentalists are playing that are really at the whim of the conductor to control how long those events last. The orchestra at this point is the largest that it ever will be, and we've covered a little bit about the rise and decline of the orchestra and how the orchestra changes. But the big changes that we hear, as opposed to the time period previous, is that we're going to have a lot more inclusion of secondary instruments, a lot more from the presence of the brass family and also the percussion family. So in general, the orchestra is quite a diverse and large ensemble at this point. I've already alluded to our final point here, the idea of form and structure that music takes in the Romantic era. And it's a little bit more what we would sort of experience as play-by-play, meaning that there's a little bit more give and take and a little less organization, because the music is trying to generally underscore a programmatic element that is happening, or that the composer wishes you to sort of think about while the piece is ongoing. So program music is music very specifically that is meant to tell a story. You can tell program music is program music generally by the title. The opposite of program music, which we've listened to a lot of in previous eras, specifically the classical era and the Baroque era, is absolute music, music that is not meant to tell a story. So these are pieces that have non-programmatic or non-descriptive titles. Programmatic music generally takes two different kinds of forms. Tone poems, which are single, self-contained pieces of music that tell a story. It's like a movie. There's no break in the storytelling narrative. Or it's a program symphony, a work that is divided up episodically into multiple sections or multiple big chapters. This is sort of akin to a TV show, especially the sort of longer format ones. In a program symphony, every movement does have sort of an internal form of its own, but the combination of the multiple movements together, like the chapters in a book, really create a larger overarching story. So, perhaps the last thing I'll mention before we go ahead and listen to our first example, which will be Paul Ducasse's The Sorcerer's Apprentice, is that we're going to encounter more dissonance. Dissonance is where a sonority, a combination of notes, feels like it is not at rest, that it requires a sense of resolution. In general, or rather first, the opposite of dissonance is consonance, events that sound like they are at rest, that they don't require a sense of resolution. The balance of this sort of sweet and salty, or chords that are at rest and require resolution, is very, very well balanced in the classical era. If you're confused as to why I'm like kind of talking about sugar and salt, consider making chocolate chip cookies. If you've made chocolate chip cookies, you might hopefully know that the recipe generally requires a little bit of salt to bring out the sweetness. So dissonance is kind of required to make consonants sound the way that it does. The proportion, though, in the classical era is it errs towards favoring consonants, whereas as we press forward in time, we start encountering more dissonance or more salt in our chocolate chip cookie. So those are many details as to what we're going to kind of focus in on in terms of being able to hear a piece as being from the Romantic era. like I said, the Romantic era composers were really well known for being somewhat long-winded. The program, symphonies, and tone poems are notoriously long-scale forms. So we're certainly not going to listen to any of these, or I'm not going to rather embed each video in full for each of these lectures, but give you a taste of each of these musical compositions. Hopefully you will, on your own, go ahead and revisit them, which is usually how you do in this class, is you don't just listen to them once in my lecture, you revisit them, but you play them let the playlist run and get a sort of better sense for what the Romantic era was all about. The first piece that we're going to talk about is Paul Ducas's The Sorcerer's Apprentice. So Paul Ducas, his birth and death dates 1865 to 1935. So he's part of the later part of the Romantic era and lived into the 20th century. His piece, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, was completed in 1897. So it's definitely going to have some 20th century ideas to it as well. That all being said, it is a tone poem, a single self-contained piece of music that does indeed tell a story. And that story is about a sorcerer's apprentice. For those of you who have seen Fantasia, this is a part of Fantasia as well. I'm definitely not going to embed the Disney video in my video. It'll get taken down immediately. However, the Sorcerer's Apprentice is about a sorcerer's apprentice. He bewitches a mop or a broom to help him clean up the workshop or the place of residence, and he practices some magic and ends up falling asleep. Anyway, we will revisit the leitmotifs shortly, and I will illustrate them as we listen to the listening example. I'll pull it up 1 second. All right, so the story here is told really effectively with 3 different leitmotifs. There's one that represents water, there's one that represents magic, and there's a leitmotif that represents the broomstick. I'll play through some of this and identify the leitmotifs and how they start interacting with one another. Wow, okay. Hold on just a second. Okay, let's try that one more time. So this is formally our introduction. It's going to serve to foreshadow some of our leitmotifs. So what we're listening to right now is the broomstick. In an elongated fashion. That's magic. This followed by the broomstick. The leitmotif that we're going to sort of miss out on in the introduction is going to be the water. Again, elongated playing around with the leitmotifs, at least 2 of them that are going to be very important in telling our story. We have lots of extended techniques so far. Staccato. That cadence sequence ends our introduction. Here's the beginning of our exposition that very clearly is going to state our broomstick motive, which happens to be in a simple compound time. We have this back, forth, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth feeling. There's our magic. It's going to start being intertwined with a water sort of motif. Into multiple pieces. Now, we'll just play a little bit more, but now we have the broomstick divided out into multiple pieces that each are now playing their own melody. It sounds a little bit more cacophonous because it's going to be set polyphonically shortly. sounds like there are more broomsticks that are now contributing to the problem. I'll let you listen to the last concluding 4 or so minutes, but as you can tell, there's really an effective way to tell a story with just 3 different ideas. The way that the ideas interact with one another helps tell the story. And of course, this is a tone poem because it does tell a story in a single self-contained movement or section. It is subdivided into sections, but they run right into one another. The orchestra also is quite diverse in terms of the sounds that we're listening to. Lots of secondary instruments, the inclusion of extended techniques. We heard lots of pizzicato. Also, other families aside from the string family end up getting a little bit more representation when it comes to the musical material and who gets to play the melody. Let's go ahead and push on to our next listening example and see how oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. Of course, when it comes to the different programmatic element that this romantic composer is interested in, and of course, is the preoccupation with the sort of magic and how magic sort of interacts with the natural world. So that's the narrative at play here. Let's go ahead and listen to another listening example so we can hear a little bit more of what the Romantic era has to offer. So Shahirazad is quite a fun piece because it is by a Russian composer, and it is a retelling of Arabian Nights. So it is it really deals with our narrative of the idea of exoticism, the interest in the musical other. We have a huge orchestra at play here, and it's a programmed symphony, a work that is divided into multiple sections. So this is a subsection called the Festival at Baghdad. We've already gone from the full ensemble to just one soloist, so we're interested in this idea of contrast, with which is something that's really, really common for Romantic era composers. So something slow, followed by a different metric feel for each particular section. So far this, we've had this sort of A, B sort of form. I hear pizzicato. We have pulse. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. We're dealing with simple time at this juncture. Festively. I'll stop it, although I would really recommend that you listen to the entire thing. So this is by Rimsky-Korsakov, a Russian composer from the Romantic era. He was part of a group called the Mighty Handful and the leader of this group. And he's one of as the teacher of this group and kind of the leader, is really responsible for sort of preserving some of the music by others aside from him, his colleagues. Such as Modest Mussorgsky, who we will listen to in one of our other segments. Let's identify some other common Romantic era trends. The orchestra is huge. Inclusion of lots of secondary instruments. Inclusion of extended techniques, using instruments in non-traditional ways. The orchestra is also less driven to just be focused on the string family, and is more diverse in its offerings to the other instrumental families. So the brass family definitely gets represented, and so does the woodwind family. In addition, we have lots of change of style, from very, very fast to very, very slow, from very melodic and lyrical to really fast, punctuated, and driven. That's Willie, if I haven't introduced him already. So a really cinematic feeling to the music. This is a longer form than the piece that we just listened to, Paul Ducas's The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Although there are leitmotifs at play here, we would have to go back to the beginning of the work in order to really understand the different melodic ideas and how they are adhered to different characters. It might be a little obvious, though, that the solo violin that gets to have a couple moments in the spotlight does represent a particular character in our story. Awesome. So why don't we take a break from part one? We'll come back for part two. We have some more listening examples, both in tone poem and program era or program symphony forms, that are really quite emblematic of this era. So let's investigate it a little further. I will see you shortly.